It was 6:30 in the morning when I woke up to red and blue lights flashing outside my house. Not because of a crime, not because of an emergency, but because my HOA president, Karen, had called the cops on me. The strobing lights painted my bedroom walls like a disco from hell. I stumbled to the window, still in my pajamas, and felt my stomach drop. 2 patrol cars sat in my driveway, their engines running, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson's curtains twitched. Next door, I could see the Johnsons pressed against their living room window like they were watching a movie. But this wasn't entertainment. This was my life being turned upside down. I threw on clothes and walked outside, my bare feet hitting the cold concrete of my driveway. The officers, one tall and lean, the other built like a linebacker, approached with that careful cop walk, hands resting near their belts. "Sir, are you David Chen?" the taller one asked, consulting a small notepad. "Yes, that's me. What's this about?" "We received a complaint from your HOA about unpaid fines and refusing to comply with community regulations. The caller said you were being hostile and threatened violence when they tried to collect." My jaw dropped. Violence? I had never raised my voice to anyone in the HOA, let alone threatened them. I played it calm, but inside, fury was building, like pressure in a boiler. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't threatened anyone. What exactly am I supposed to have done?" The linebacker cop stepped forward, his radio crackling with distant chatter. "Ma'am, Karen Fletcher says you owe several thousand in fines for property violations and refused to pay. She says you slammed the door in her face and yelled obscenities." Karen Fletcher. Of course. "Officers, I've never slammed a door on anyone or used profanity. Mrs. Fletcher and I have had disagreements about some of the fines she's issued, but I've been respectful in every interaction." The tall cop studied my face, then glanced at my house. My lawn was immaculate. My mailbox was pristine. My driveway was spotless. Nothing looked like the property of someone violating community standards. "Sir, we're just here to keep the peace and get both sides of the story. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned she's coming by this morning to discuss the matter further. We'd appreciate it if everyone could remain civil." Civil. As if I was the problem. "Course, officers, I'm always civil." They nodded and walked back to their cars, but didn't leave. They parked across the street, clearly planning to supervise whatever confrontation Karen had orchestrated. I stood in my driveway, watching neighbors peek from behind blinds and through windows, feeling like a criminal in my own home. This wasn't about money. This was about control. And as I stood there, watching those red and blue lights finally shut off, I realized something Karen didn't know, something that was going to change everything. She had no idea that the financial strings of our HOA were already in my hands. Every HOA has a villain. Ours wore red glasses, carried a clipboard, and believed she owned every inch of our lives. Went fee too. I first bought my house in Willowbrook Estates 3 years ago. Everything seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained properties, friendly neighbors waving from their front yards. The realtor had mentioned the HOA almost as an afterthought. "Oh, there's a small homeowners association, nothing too strict, just keeps property. Values up." What she didn't mention was Karen Fletcher. Karen moved into the neighborhood about 6 months after me, and within 2 months, she had somehow maneuvered herself into the position of HOA president. How she managed this political coup, I never fully understood, but it involved a lot of door-to-door campaigning, promises about maintaining community standards, and leveraging the fears of older residents about property values. She was in her early 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed designed to give her permanent disapproval lines. Those red glasses, thick, angular frames that made her eyes look larger and more predatory, became her signature. But it was the clipboard that really told you everything you needed to know about Karen Fletcher. She carried it everywhere, filled with printed HOA regulations, violation notices, and what I came to think of as her enemies list. The first time I met Karen was on a Tuesday morning when I was leaving for work. I found her standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand, staring at my house with the intensity of a building inspector. "You must be David," she said, without introducing herself. "I'm Karen Fletcher, HOA president. We need to discuss your mailbox." I looked at my mailbox. It was black metal, simple, clean, and identical to every other mailbox on the street. "What about it?" "The paint is fading on the post. Community standards require all mailboxes to be maintained in pristine condition. I'm issuing you a courtesy warning, but if it's not repainted within 2 weeks, there will be a fine." I walked over to examine the post. If there was fading, it was microscopic. The thing looked brand new. "Mrs. Fletcher, I don't see any fading." "It's there," she said, making a note on her clipboard. "Trust me, I have an eye for these things." That was my introduction to Karen's eye for these things. Over the next few months, she found violations everywhere. My grass was a half-inch too long. My garden mulch was the wrong shade of brown. My outdoor Christmas lights stayed up 3 days past the arbitrary January 15th deadline she had invented. Each violation came with a letter, formal, typed, and increasingly threatening. The fines started at $25, then jumped to $50, then $100. Karen had a special talent for making ordinary homeownership feel like a criminal offense. But it wasn't just me. I started noticing the pattern throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow next door, got fined because her rose bushes extended 6 inches beyond the approved planting zone. The Johnsons got hit with a $200 penalty because their 10-year-old son left his bike on the front lawn overnight. Even the Hendersons, who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and kept their property immaculate, received a violation notice because their front door wreath was non-compliant seasonal decoration. Karen had turned our peaceful neighborhood into a police state, with herself as the self-appointed dictator. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early fall. I was outside raking leaves when Karen appeared at my property line, clipboard ready, red glasses glinting in the autumn sun. "David, we need to talk." "What now, Karen?" "Your leaves." She gestured at the pile I'd been building. "They're blowing onto community property. That's littering, and it's going to cost you." I stared at her. We were talking about leaves. Natural, biodegradable, autumn leaves that had fallen from trees the HOA had planted. "Karen, they're leaves. They're a violation. Section 4.7 of the IU, Community Guidelines, clearly states that homeowners are responsible for maintaining their organic waste within property boundaries. I'm literally cleaning them up right now. But they blew onto the sidewalk, which is community property. The damage is done. She handed me a violation notice with a $500 fine. That's when I realized this wasn't about community standards or property values. Karen Fletcher thrived on humiliation and power, not community service. She had found a legal way to bully an entire neighborhood, and she was drunk on the authority. But as I stood there, holding that ridiculous $500 fine for the crime of autumn leaves, Karen made her biggest mistake. "David, I hope you understand this is just the beginning. If you continue to resist community compliance, the fines will increase exponentially. I have the full authority of the HOA behind me, and I'm not afraid to use it. We can make your life here very, very difficult." She smiled when she said it. Actually smiled, That's when I decided Karen Fletcher had no idea who she was messing with. The first letter came with a $500 fine. By the fourth letter, Karen claimed I owed more than $12,000 after the leaf incident. Karen launched what I canned only describe as a campaign of psychological warfare. The letters arrived with military precision. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, each one more ridiculous than the last. Letter number 2. $300 fine for excessive noise because I had mowed my lawn at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Apparently, the community quiet hours extended until noon on weekends, according to a regulation I had never seen and which Karen could never produce in writing. Letter number 3. $750 fine for unauthorized vehicle storage because I had parked my car in my own driveway for 3 consecutive days without moving it. Karen claimed this violated the Dynamic Property Maintenance Clause. Letter number 4. $200 fine for landscaping non-compliance because the tree in my front yard had grown 6 inches taller than the approved height maximum. Each letter arrived in the same format. Official HOA letterhead. Karen's name in bold as President and Compliance Officer, and language that sounded like it was written by a lawyer having a particularly vindictive day. The fines compounded with interest. Late fees stacked on top of violation fees. Administrative costs appeared out of nowhere. My kitchen table disappeared under an avalanche of these letters. I would come home from work to find them wedged in my doorframe, taped to my mailbox, or slipped under car windshield wipers. Karen had turned correspondence into a weapon, and she was conducting a paper blitzkrieg against my sanity. But the letters weren't the worst part. The worst part was how they affected my daily life. I started walking to my car differently in the mornings, scanning for Karen's red glasses before stepping outside. I mowed my lawn with a stopwatch, making sure I stayed within her arbitrary time windows. I found myself second-guessing every normal activity. Was watering my plants at 7 p.m. too late? Would bringing in groceries after dark constitute excessive nighttime activity? The psychological impact was exactly what Karen intended. She wasn't trying to collect money, she was trying to break my spirit. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening when my phone rang at work. David Chen? This is Patricia from Howard & Associates Legal Services. We represent the Willowbrook Estates HOA regarding your outstanding compliance violations. My heart stopped. I'm sorry. Who is this? We've been retained to collect on your delinquent fines, which now total $12,347, including interest and administrative fees. Our client has authorized us to begin foreclosure proceedings if payment isn't received within 48 hours. Foreclosure. She was threatening to take my house. I asked for documentation, for proof of these legal services, for anything official. The woman on the phone became evasive, claimed everything was being mailed, and hung up abruptly when I pressed for details. That evening, I did some research. Howard & Associates Legal Services didn't exist. The phone number traced back to a Google Voice account. The entire threatening call had been Karen, probably using a fake name and an altered voice. But the psychological damage was real. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if someone could actually steal my house over fabricated HOA violations. Karen was playing a game, but the stakes felt terrifyingly real. The next morning, I woke up to pounding on my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Karen standing there with 2 police officers, the same ones from the previous week. I opened the door, and Karen stepped forward with her clipboard, looking triumphant. "David, you've ignored our final notices. These officers are here to witness our last attempt to collect before we move forward with foreclosure proceedings." The taller cop looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we're just here to keep the peace." "Ma'am, says you owe money to the HOA." Karen smiled her predatory smile. "David, you can end this right now. Write a check for 12 out 347, or we proceed with legal action." I looked at her, standing in my doorway with police backup, threatening to take my home over invented violations and fraudulent fines. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. "Karen," I said calmly, "I'm not paying you a single penny. And if you want to take my house, go ahead and try." Her smile faltered for just a moment. She had no idea that I had already seen something she didn't know I had access to. Something that was going to destroy her completely. I wasn't supposed to see it. But one late night, buried in an overlooked email chain, I found the document that changed everything: the HOA bank account statement. It was 3 days after Karen's theatrical visit with the police officers. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by her threatening letters, trying to make sense of the legal maze she had constructed around me. My laptop was open, and I was researching HOA law, looking for any regulation or precedent that could help me fight back. That's when I remembered something from when I first bought my house. The previous owner, Mr. Martinez, had been involved in some kind of property dispute with the original developer. The settlement had included language about ongoing financial interest in community assets and trustee rights pending resolution of development obligations. At the time, my real estate lawyer had explained it as boring legal boilerplate, nothing that would ever matter. But sitting there at 2 a.m., desperate for any advantage, I decided to dig through those old documents. I found the file buried in my email archives, property transfer, Addendum C, ongoing obligations and rights. The language was dense, full of legal terminology that made my eyes glaze over. But buried in Section 12, subsection D, I found something interesting. Purchaser shall maintain financial oversight privileges regarding community association accounts until such time as all development obligations are satisfied and formally released by all parties. Financial oversight privileges. What did that mean? I kept digging through the documents until I found a list of usernames and passwords that Mr. Martinez had provided for ongoing account monitoring. At the time, I had assumed these were for utility companies or something similarly mundane. I had never bothered to check them. But at 2 a.m., with Karen's threats echoing in my mind, mundane seemed worth investigating. The first few usernames led to expired utility accounts and old service providers. But the fifth one opened a door I never expected: online access to the Willowbrook Estates HOA master account at First National Bank. My heart pounded as the page loaded. According to the account settings, I was listed as a secondary account supervisor with full read access to all transactions, statements, and account activity. And what I saw made my blood run cold. Karen Fletcher had been using the HOA account like her personal ATM. The statements painted a picture of systematic embezzlement stretching back almost 2 years. Charges at high-end department stores labeled as office supplies, cash withdrawals of $500, $800 every few days marked as maintenance expenses, a $200 charge at a luxury spa listed as community meeting costs. But the most damning evidence was a series of transfers to an account labeled K. Fletcher, Compliance Management Services. Over the past 18 months, Karen had paid herself more than $45,000 in consulting fees for managing HOA compliance, money that came directly from homeowners' dues and the fines she had been levying against residents. She wasn't just power-hungry, she was a thief. I scrolled through months of statements, taking screenshots, building a case that would destroy her completely. Every threatening letter she had sent, every fabricated fine, every humiliating confrontation, it had all been cover for a massive theft scheme. But then I found something even more shocking. According to the account documentation, my secondary account supervisor status wasn't just read-only. The original property settlement had given me actual signing authority on the account. Mr. Martinez had negotiated this as insurance against developer fraud, and when I bought the house, those rights had transferred to me. I wasn't just a witness to Karen's crimes. I was, technically, a co-owner of the account she had been stealing from. Karen had been threatening me with foreclosure using money that legally belonged, in part, to me. I sat back in my chair, staring at the computer screen, feeling like I had just found the nuclear. Codes. Karen Fletcher had made two critical mistakes. First, she had targeted someone with access to her financial crimes. Second, she had done it so publicly, with such theatrical cruelty, that she had created dozens of witnesses who would be eager to see her fall. But I wasn't going to confront her immediately. Karen loved drama, loved public scenes where she could flex her authority and humiliate people. If she wanted a show, I was going to give her the performance of a lifetime. But first, I needed allies. I thought I was the only one. Then one night, over coffee at my neighbor's kitchen table, the truth spilled out. Karen had made enemies everywhere. The morning after discovering Karen's financial crimes, I woke up with a plan. But I needed to be careful. Karen was cunning, paranoid, and had already demonstrated a willingness to involve law enforcement in her personal vendettas. If I was going to expose her, I needed rock-solid evidence and community support. I started with Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow who lived next door. Mrs. Chen was in her 70s, had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, and maintained her property with the dedication of someone who took genuine pride in her home. If Karen had been targeting her with bogus fines, Mrs. Chen would be a credible witness and potentially a powerful ally. I knocked on her door Sunday evening, carrying a plate of cookies my sister had made, a peace offering and conversation starter. "David, how nice to see you," Mrs. Chen said, inviting me into her immaculate living room. "I've been meaning to ask how you're handling all this nonsense with Karen." The opening I needed. "Mrs. Chen, I'm starting to think Karen's fines aren't legitimate. Have you been having problems with her, too?" Mrs. Chen's face darkened. She disappeared into her kitchen and returned with a shoebox filled with letters. Dozens of them, all bearing Karen's aggressive letterhead. "David, this woman has fined me $3,800 over the past year. Look at this." She pulled out a letter at random. $100 because my roses extended beyond the approved planting perimeter. These roses have been here for 12 years, since before the HOA even existed. She showed me letter after letter. Fines for her mailbox being insufficiently reflective. Penalties for excessive bird feeder activity that was apparently attracting too many birds to community property. A $300 charge because her newspaper was delivered 15 minutes before the approved delivery window. "Mrs. Chen, this is insane. Have you tried fighting any of these?" "David, I'm 73 years old. I live on Social Security and my late husband's pension. I can't afford lawyers, and Karen knows it. She picks on people like me because we can't fight back." That's when I realized the scope of Karen's operation. She wasn't randomly targeting homeowners. She was strategically selecting victims who seemed least likely to resist. Elderly residents, single parents, young professionals who were too busy to fight back. "Mrs. Chen, what if I told you I might have a way to stop her?" Her eyes lit up with hope and curiosity. Over the next 2 hours, I carefully explained what I had discovered about Karen's embezzlement, leaving out the details about my account access. Mrs. Chen listened with growing amazement and anger. You mean she's been stealing from us while fining us for imaginary violations? That's exactly what I mean. But I need help building a case. Would you be willing to talk to other neighbors? See if they've had similar experiences? Mrs. Chen smiled, for the first time since I'd arrived. David, I've been waiting 2 years for someone to stand up to that woman. You just made an old lady very happy. The next evening, Mrs. Chen called me with news. She had spoken to 8 neighbors, and all of them had stories about Karen's increasingly aggressive fines and bizarre violations. The Hendersons had been fined $200 for seasonal decoration non-compliance because they had left their Christmas wreath up until January 20th. The Johnsons owed $800 for child activity violations. Their kids had been too loud playing in their own backyard. Even the Patels, who had moved in just 3 months ago, had already racked up $600 in fines for new resident orientation failures. But the most heartbreaking story came from Sarah Martinez, a single mother of 2 who worked double shifts as a nurse. Sarah had been fined $2,300 over 6 months for violations including excessive vehicle presence. Her car was parked in her driveway, child equipment storage, her kids' bikes were visible in the garage, and professional activity disruption. She received work calls at home. David, Mrs. Chen told me over the phone, Sarah is thinking about selling her house. She can't afford the fines, and Karen is threatening foreclosure. This woman is destroying families. That's when I knew we had to act fast. I organized a meeting for the following Thursday evening at Mrs. Chen's house. 7 neighbors showed up, each carrying folders of Karen's threatening letters. We spread the documentation across Mrs. Chen's dining room table, and what emerged was a pattern of systematic harassment that looked almost like organized crime. She's not just collecting fines, said Tom Henderson, studying the timeline of violations. She's ramping up the pressure on specific targets. Look, Sarah gets hit every 2 weeks like clockwork. Mrs. Chen gets a new violation every time. She pays the previous one. It's like she's trying to force people out of the neighborhood. Why? Asked Sarah Martinez. What does she gain by making us miserable? I had been wondering the same thing, but looking at all the evidence spread across the table, a theory was forming. What if it's not about the fines? What if it's about the houses? Everyone looked at me. Think about it. Karen moved here 2 years ago. Since then, she's been systematically targeting long-term residents and families who might resist gentrification. If she can force people to sell, property values go up, and the neighborhood demographic changes. But how does that benefit her? Tom asked. I pulled out my phone and showed them something I had discovered that afternoon. Karen Fletcher's real estate license, issued just 3 months after she became HOA president. She's not just the HOA president, she's a real estate agent. If she can force turnover in the neighborhood, she gets to list the properties and collect commissions on every sale. The room went quiet as everyone processed the implications. So she's been stealing our HOA dues, fining us with fake violations, and trying to force us to sell so she can profit from the real estate transactions? Sarah asked. That's exactly what I think she's doing. Tom Henderson slammed his fist on the table. We're going to stop her, Mrs. Chen smiled grimly. David, what do you need us to do? I need everyone to document everything. Every letter, every interaction, every payment you've made. I need witnesses who will speak publicly about what she's done. And I need everyone to be prepared for Karen. To fight back dirty. She's already fighting dirty, Sarah said. How much worse can it get? I thought about the fake legal calls, the police escorts, the threats of foreclosure. she's going to escalate. Karen feeds on fear and isolation. But if we stand together, she loses her power. As the meeting broke up, Mrs. Chen pulled me aside. David, there's something else. Karen has been asking questions about you specifically. She's been calling neighbors, trying to get information about your finances, your work schedule, anything she can use against you. I felt a chill. What kind of questions? She wanted to know if you live alone, what kind of car you drive, whether you travel for work. David, I think she's planning something big. As I walked home that night, I felt the weight of what we were up against. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant drunk on HOA power. She was a calculating predator who had turned our neighborhood into her personal profit center. But she had made one critical error. She had no idea that her next move was going to give me the perfect opportunity to destroy her in front of everyone she had terrorized. Karen loved an audience. So when she called an emergency HOA meeting, she had no idea it would be her trial. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to every house in Willowbrook Estates with Karen's characteristic theatrical flair. Emergency community meeting, mandatory attendance, compliance and financial obligations. Saturday, 2:00 p.m., Community Center. Mrs. Chen called me within an hour. David, she's planning something big. The letter mentions significant community violations and necessary enforcement actions. I think she's going to try to publicly humiliate you. I had been expecting this. Karen's psychological profile was predictable. She was a narcissist who craved public validation of her authority. The private confrontations, the police escorts, the threatening letters, they had all been building toward this moment when she could shame me in front of the entire neighborhood and establish herself as the undisputed queen of our community. What Karen didn't know was that I had spent the past 2 weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. Mrs. Chen, this is perfect. Can you make sure everyone from our group is there? And ask them to sit together, preferably near the front. What are you planning, David? I'm going to give Karen exactly what she wants. A public showdown. But it's not going to end the way she expects. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that would have been perfect for yard work or neighborhood barbecues. The kind of community activities that Karen's reign of terror had effectively eliminated. Instead, 57 homeowners filed into the community center's main room, the air thick with tension and the smell of burnt coffee from a machine that had seen better decades. I arrived early, carrying a thick folder and a small recorder. My allies had taken my advice and clustered near the front. Mrs. Chen, the Hendersons, Sarah Martinez, and 4 other families who had been targeted by Karen's escalating fine scheme. Karen made her entrance at exactly 2:04 p.m., dressed like she was attending a corporate board meeting rather than a neighborhood gathering. Her red glasses caught the fluorescent lighting as she surveyed the room with obvious satisfaction. She had arranged for 2 folding tables at the front. One for her materials and one conspicuously empty. Thank you all for attending this emergency meeting, Karen began, her voice carrying the artificial authority of someone who had watched too many courtroom dramas. We have serious business to address today regarding community compliance and the actions of certain residents who have chosen to disregard their obligations to this neighborhood. She paused for effect, letting her gaze sweep across the room before landing on me. David Chen has accumulated more than $15,000 in community violation fines over the past several months. Despite multiple attempts to work with him, he has refused to pay these legitimate assessments and has become increasingly hostile toward HOA representatives. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw several neighbors glance in my direction, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Furthermore, Karen continued. Mr. Chen has been spreading false information about HOA operations and attempting to undermine community authority. Today, we're going to resolve this situation once and for all. That's when I saw them. 2 uniformed police officers standing near the back door. Karen had called in law enforcement again, but this time it wasn't for intimidation. She was planning to have me arrested in front of the entire neighborhood. Karen turned to address me directly. David, you have one final opportunity to pay your outstanding fines and apologize to this community for your disruptive behavior. Otherwise, these officers will escort you from the premises, and we will begin foreclosure proceedings on Monday morning. The room went dead silent. This was Karen's moment of triumph, the public execution she had been building toward for months. I stood up slowly, folder in hand. Karen, before I respond to your accusations, I'd like to ask you a few questions about HOA finances. Her confidence faltered slightly. This meeting isn't about— Actually, it is. Since you're demanding payment from me, I think the community deserves to know how their HOA dues are being spent. I opened my folder and pulled out the First Bank statement. According to First National Bank records for the Willowbrook Estates HOA account, you've paid yourself $47,000 over the past 18 months for something called Compliance Management Services. Can you explain what those services are? Karen's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. Those are legitimate administrative fees approved by the HOA board. What board? According to our HOA bylaws, all expenditures over $500 require board approval. But there's no record of any board meetings since you became president. You've been operating as a one-person dictatorship. I pulled out another document. Here's a $3,200 charge to Serenity Springs Day Spa, labeled as Community Meeting Costs. Did we have a meeting at a spa, Karen? The murmur in the room got louder. Neighbors were starting to shift in their seats, looking between Karen and me like they were watching a tennis match. Karen's voice got shrill. You have no right to examine HOA financial records. This is a violation of— Actually, Karen, I have every right. You see, when I bought my house, I inherited something from the previous owner that you don't know about. I pulled out the property, settlement documents, and held them up for the room to see. I'm a co-signatory on the HOA account. I have full access to all financial records. And what I found is that you've been embezzling community funds while inventing fake violations to extort money from our neighbors. The room erupted. Neighbors started talking over each other, some standing up to get a better look at the documents I was holding. Karen looked like she had been struck by lightning. That's impossible. You can't— Mrs. Chen, would you please stand up? Mrs. Chen rose from her seat, holding her own folder of Karen's letters. Tell everyone how much Karen has. Fined you for having roses in your yard. $3,800, Mrs. Chen said clearly, for flowers that have been there for 12 years. Sarah Martinez, how much do you owe for the crime of parking in your own driveway? Sarah stood. $2,300. She said, my car was creating excessive vehicle presence. One by one, my allies stood and shared their stories. The room's mood shifted from confusion to anger as neighbors realized the scope of Karen's scam. But Karen wasn't finished. This is all fabricated, she screamed, her composure completely shattered. David Chen is lying, and these people are helping him. Officers, I want him arrested for harassment and fraud. The 2 police officers looked at each other uncomfortably. The tall one, who had been to my house before, stepped forward. Ma'am, we can't arrest someone for presenting financial documents at an HOA meeting. That's when I played my final card. Officers, I'd like to report embezzlement. I have bank records showing that Karen Fletcher has stolen nearly $50,000 from this community association. I'm prepared to file charges." Karen went completely silent. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "Karen," I said calmly, "you've spent months threatening to take my house. But you've been stealing from an account that I legally co-own. Every fake fine, every threatening letter, every humiliating confrontation, you've been extorting people with their own money." I turned to address the room. "Karen Fletcher is not our HOA president. She's a thief who has been using fabricated violations to cover up her embezzlement. And now everyone knows." The police officers approached Karen, who was now shaking with rage and fear. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to answer some questions." As Karen was escorted from the community center, she turned back to Tatitua. "Scream at me one final time. This isn't over. I'll sue you for everything you have." But her voice was already fading, drowned out by the sound of 50 neighbors finally feeling free to express years of suppressed anger at the woman who had terrorized their community. The Queen of Willowbrook Estates had fallen. She started screaming before I even finished speaking. But this time, no one listened. The community center had become a crime scene, but not the kind Karen had planned. As the police officers escorted her toward the exit, she transformed from calculated predator to cornered animal, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. "You can't do this to me!" Karen shrieked, struggling against the officer's gentle but firm grip. "I am the president of this HOA. I have authority here. These people are lying." But nobody was listening anymore. The spell Karen had cast over our neighborhood, the fear, the intimidation, the learned helplessness, had been broken by simple exposure to truth. Mrs. Henderson, who had been silent for most of the meeting, stood up with tears in her eyes. "Karen, you fined us $200 because our Christmas wreath stayed up 5 days too long. 5 days. We've lived here 15 years, and you made us feel like criminals in our own home." Sarah Martinez joined in, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "You threatened to take my house because my children were too loud playing in our backyard? My kids stopped playing outside because they were afraid of you." One by one, neighbors began sharing their stories. Not the careful, documented testimonies we had prepared, but raw, emotional accounts of what Karen had put them through. The room filled with voices that had been silenced for too long. Karen's response was to get louder, more desperate. I was protecting property values. I was maintaining community standards. These people are ungrateful. Without me, this neighborhood would be chaos. The taller police officer, Officer Martinez, stepped closer to Karen. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. We just want to ask you some questions about the financial allegations." "Financial allegations?" Karen's voice hit a pitch that made several people wince. "This is a conspiracy. David Chen has fabricated those documents. He's been harassing me for months, and now he's turned you all against me." I remained seated, watching Karen's meltdown with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine pity. This was what happened when someone who had built their entire identity around power and control suddenly found themselves powerless. "Karen," I said quietly, and the room went silent again. "You can stop now. It's over." She whirled around to face me, her red glasses askew, her carefully styled hair now disheveled from her struggle with the officers. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll sue you for defamation, for harassment, for—" "With what lawyers?" I interrupted, pulling out another document from my folder. "Your legal counsel, Howard and Associates? The fake law firm you used to threaten me over the phone?" The room gasped. Karen's face went from red to pale white. "I recorded that call, Karen. I have your voice on tape pretending to be a lawyer, threatening foreclosure with non-existent legal authority." Officer Martinez looked at his partner with raised eyebrows. "Ma'am, impersonating legal counsel is a serious offense." Karen's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she grabbed the back of a folding chair for support. "That's not... I never... You can't prove..." "I can prove all of it," I said, standing up and addressing the room rather than Karen. "The embezzlement, the fake fines, the fraudulent legal threats, the harassment campaign. Karen turned our neighborhood into her personal ATM, and when people started to resist, she escalated to intimidation and fraud." Tom Henderson raised his hand. "David, what happens now? What about all the money she stole?" Before I could answer, Karen found her voice again. "Stole? I didn't steal anything. Those were legitimate administrative fees. I worked 20 hours a week managing this community." "Managing what?" Mrs. Chen asked sharply. "You never organized a single community event. You never coordinated any actual maintenance. All you did was walk around with your clipboard, inventing violations and threatening people." "I maintained property values," Karen shot back. "Before I became president, this neighborhood was declining. People were letting their properties deteriorate. I brought order." "You brought terror," Sarah Martinez said quietly. "My 8-year-old son asked me if the mean lady was going to take our house away. He was having nightmares about you, Karen." That seemed to hit Karen differently than the financial accusations. For just a moment, her expression flickered with something that might have been shame, but it didn't last. "I don't care about your son's nightmares," she snapped. "I care about maintaining a quality community for people who actually respect property. Values and community standards." The mask was completely off now. Karen wasn't even pretending to be a reasonable authority figure anymore. She was revealing herself as exactly what she had always been: a bully who enjoyed making people suffer. Officer Martinez had heard enough. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come to the station to answer questions about these financial irregularities. You have the right to remain silent." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Karen screamed. "This is America. I have rights. You can't arrest me for doing my job as HOA president." "Karen," I said, pulling out one final document, "you're not the HOA president anymore." I held up a petition signed by 34 homeowners, more than the 2/3 majority required by our HOA bylaws to remove an officer. We're calling for an emergency vote of no confidence. All in favor of removing Karen Fletcher as HOA president? Hands shot up around the room. I counted quickly. 41 votes in favor, 0 opposed. Even the handful of neighbors who hadn't been directly targeted by Karen's scheme had seen enough. Motion carries. "Karen, you're fired." The room erupted in applause, but Karen's reaction was not what I expected. She didn't scream or struggle or threaten lawsuits. Instead, she went completely quiet and still, staring at me with an expression of pure, concentrated hatred. "This isn't over," she said, in a voice so low and cold it made my skin crawl. "You think you're clever, David Chen, but you have no idea what you've started. I know where you live. I know your schedule. I know everything about you." Officer Martinez stepped between us immediately. "Ma'am, that sounds like a threat." Karen seemed to realize what she had just said, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "It's not a threat. It's a promise. Nobody humiliates Karen Fletcher and gets away with it." The officer's partner moved to Karen's other side. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and now criminal threats. You have the right to remain silent." As they led Karen out of the community center in handcuffs, she turned back one more time. "I'll be back," she screamed. "You can't keep me away from my neighborhood. This is my community." But the doors closed behind her, and Karen Fletcher's reign of terror was finally over. The room remained silent for a long moment after she was gone, as if nobody could quite believe what had just happened. Mrs. Chen broke the silence. "David, is it really over?" I looked around the room at faces that seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the entire community. "It's really over," I said. "Karen is going to face criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. She'll never have power over this neighborhood again." The applause that followed was different from the earlier outburst. This wasn't just celebration. It was relief. Pure, overwhelming relief from people who had been living under oppression for too long. But as I packed up my documents and prepared to leave the community center, I couldn't shake Karen's final words. "Nobody humiliates Karen Fletcher and gets away with it." Something told me that even though the HOA nightmare was over, Karen Fletcher herself might not be finished with me yet. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a neighborhood. Again, not a prison. 3 months after Karen's arrest, I woke up on a Saturday morning to something I hadn't heard in over 2 years. Children laughing in their own backyards. I walked outside with my coffee and saw Sarah Martinez's kids playing tag on their front lawn, no longer afraid that the mean lady would find their mother for excessive child activity. Mrs. Chen was tending to her roses, which had grown 6 inches beyond their original boundaries without triggering any violation notices. The Hendersons had put up an elaborate Halloween display that would have cost them $800 in Karen's regime, but now simply brought smiles to passing dog walkers. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates had been remarkable and swift. Within a week of Karen's removal, we had elected a new HOA board with actual community input. Mrs. Chen became our treasurer, Tom Henderson took over as president, and Sarah Martinez volunteered to coordinate the social events that Karen had never bothered to organize. Our first act was to void every single fine that Karen had issued during her presidency. The legal basis was simple. She had been operating without board oversight, which made all her unilateral penalties invalid under our HOA bylaws. Families got refunds totaling more than $30,000 in fraudulent fines. The embezzlement case moved through the courts with surprising speed. Karen's lawyer, a real one this time, tried to argue that she had legitimately earned her consulting fees through administrative work. But the prosecutor had our bank records, recorded phone calls of her impersonating legal counsel, and testimony from dozens of residents about her harassment campaign. Karen Fletcher pled guilty to embezzlement, fraud, and criminal intimidation. She was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her real estate license was revoked, and she was banned from serving on any homeowners association in the state. But the legal victory was less satisfying than the community healing that followed. We organized block parties that would have been impossible under Karen's rule. Mrs. Chen taught neighborhood kids how to garden. The Hendersons started a tool lending library in their garage. Sarah Martinez coordinated a babysitting co-op that helped working parents like herself. Most importantly, we rewrote our HOA regulations to prevent another Karen Fletcher situation. All expenditures now required board approval. All fines had to be based on specific written violations with a reasonable appeals process. No single person could accumulate the kind of unchecked authority that Karen had abused. The changes weren't just practical, they were psychological. People started making eye contact when they walked their dogs. Neighbors began having conversations instead of hurrying past each other. The fear that had permeated our community for 2 years gradually dissolved. But the most profound change was in how people viewed authority itself. "You know what I learned from all this?" Tom Henderson said during one of our monthly board meetings. "We gave Karen power because we thought someone else would handle the boring HOA stuff. We stopped paying attention, and she turned that into tyranny." He was right. Karen hadn't seized power. We had essentially handed it to her by being passive about community governance. The real lesson wasn't about defeating one bad person, but about the importance of civic engagement at every level. 6 months after Karen's arrest, I was working in my front yard when a moving truck pulled up to her old house. A young couple, with 2 toddlers, began unloading boxes, and I walked over to introduce myself. "Welcome to Willowbrook Estates," I said. "I'm David Chen. Let me know if you need anything." The husband smiled and shook my hand. "Thanks. I'm Mike. This is my wife, Jenny. We heard this was a really friendly neighborhood." "It is now," I said, and meant it. As I helped them carry boxes, Jenny asked about the HOA. "We've heard different things about homeowners associations. Some people say they're really strict and controlling. What's this one like?" I thought about how to answer. I could tell them about Karen, about the threats and harassment and fake fines. I could warn them about how quickly community authority could be abused by the wrong person. Instead, I smiled and said, "Our HOA is what we make it. As long as people stay involved and hold our leaders accountable, it works fine. The problems start when people stop paying attention." That evening, I sat on my front porch with a beer, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that felt genuinely peaceful for the first time since I'd lived there. Mrs. Chen was watering her roses. The Martinez kids were riding bikes in their driveway. The Hendersons were grilling burgers and had invited their new neighbors over. It was everything an HOA was supposed to create: a sense of community, shared responsibility, and mutual respect. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "David, thank you for giving us our neighborhood back." But the truth was more complicated than that. I hadn't given anyone anything. What we'd accomplished, we'd done together. Karen had been defeated not by one person with access to bank records, but by a community that had finally decided to stand up for itself. The real victory wasn't exposing Karen's crimes or getting her arrested. The real victory was proving that ordinary people, when they work together, can overcome bullies and reclaim their power. As I sat there watching my neighbors enjoy their freedom, I realized something important. Karen Fletcher had actually done us a favor. Her tyranny had been so extreme, so obviously wrong, that it had forced us to become a real community in response. We were stronger now than we had ever been when everything was peaceful. A year later, I still get emails from people who have heard our story through neighborhood networks and social media. HOA horror stories, it turns out, are depressingly common. But so are communities finding ways to fight back. The lesson isn't that all HOAs are bad, or that all authority figures are corrupt. The lesson is simpler and more universal. Power unchecked becomes power abused, and the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Karen Fletcher thought she could steal from us, intimidate us, and control us because she believed we were too passive to resist. She was wrong, and sitting on my porch that evening, watching children play freely in their own yards, I smiled, knowing that she would never make that mistake again. Our neighborhood had learned something that every community needs to learn. When people stand together, bullies fall. And when bullies fall, everyone wins. The end.
Все удивились, когда в Академию К9 пришла девушка. Обычно там занимались мужчины. Крепкие, строгие, готовые к суровой службе. Она же выглядела хрупкой, с тихим голосом и настойчивым взглядом. Инструкторы посмеивались, курсанты перешептывались. Она не выдержит. Но она держала голову прямо и молча проходила все этапы подготовки. Среди десятков молодых собак был один немецкий овчаренок, который не подчинялся никому. Он рычал, отворачивался, отказывался выполнять команды даже самых опытных инструкторов. Его считали проблемным и готовились списать. Но в тот день, когда девушка впервые подошла к вольерам, щенок вдруг замер. Его взгляд встретился с ее глазами, и словно что-то щелкнуло. Он тихо подошел к прутьям и положил лапу на сетку. Все рассмеялись. Да, он просто играет. Но девушка улыбнулась и протянула руку. Пес, который не доверял никому, позволил ей прикоснуться к себе. С этого момента он будто выбрал ее. На тренировках он слушался только ее голоса. Когда другие пытались дать команды, он отворачивался, но стоило ей сказать, выполнял мгновенно. Инструкторы были поражены. Собака, считавшаяся непригодной, стала показывать лучшие результаты. Но самые трудные испытания ждали впереди. На итоговой проверке нужно было пройти полосу препятствий, найти спрятанный предмет и задержать преступника. Все были уверены, что девушка не справится. Слишком тяжелое задание для нее. Когда настала ее очередь, сердце у всех замирало. Собака неслась через барьеры, прыгала, искала и все время не сводила глаз со своей хозяйки. В момент задержания он сработал идеально, защитив ее и выполнив команду. Быстрее всех тишина повисла на плацу, потом раздались аплодисменты. Те, кто вчера смеялись, сегодня смотрели с уважением. Девушка обняла своего пса, а он прижался к ней, словно говоря: «Мы команда». Так в академии появилась легенда — собака, которая сама выбрала себе единственного партнера. И девушка, доказавшая, что сила не в мышцах, а в вере и взаимной преданности.